most frequently covered in the current media is President Trump and more generally other new populist leaders, using populist broadly, from France with Macron to the Brexit referendum in England to earlier transformations in Greece, to the Catalan referendum and battles with the national Spanish government now. There was a presentation 2 days ago by Renee Flores from the University of Washington. You were there? No? Okay. On Trump's labeling of immigrants, especially Mexicans, as bad people. And his key question was, did or might Trump's comments about Mexicans and immigrants more generally have moved public opinion to become more negative toward immigrants and especially Mexicans, with the wall as a visible symbol, etc. And he started with, and he's done several papers on this, several different kinds of methods. He started with an ethnography of one town in Pennsylvania where the citizens and the local government openly adopted rules that were laws that were quite punitive of immigrants, which is very unusual in the U.S. This is usually left to the national government. But this town had done so. So he went and did a case study of the town, talked to lots of people, tried to find out, did this reflect citizens, or what were the dynamics and what was going on? And what he did find was lots of civic group activities. There were anti-immigrant groups that were present, and they became more active around this time and after this period. It was called Hazel Crest. Name was roughly that, near Scranton, Pennsylvania, middle of the state. But he said he could not get a sense from his ethnography of what did the citizens more generally feel, because there are all kinds of citizens. So he then shifted and he looked at national surveys. He then did some laboratory experiments where he interviewed and he gave two kinds of scenarios to different people, to several hundred people who came in. And the interesting, surprising bottom line was that he found very little evidence of change by citizens, of change in their attitudes in a negative direction toward immigrants. He found a little bit, but it tended to be quite brief and quite small, and in some of these where they had interviews over weeks and weeks and weeks, they lasted maybe 2 weeks after a particularly active statement by Trump and other political leaders, but then after 2 weeks that increase in negativity seems to have evaporated. Okay, how can we reconcile, or how can we try to understand better the potential strong or weak contextual change? That is, how might the context in such as speeches against immigrants have impact or not, and where and how does this relate to broader issues of neighborhood change, neighborhood dynamics, urban policies, which we're covering in the course. The main view, by contrast, of many people is that most values, most views, most opinions about what's right, wrong, who do you vote for, comes from your background, often from your parents. Bourdieu's made a strong statement that social reproduction is the main process, that you do what your parents did, and there's social reproduction from one person, one generation to the next, and that there's not much change. People don't get richer or poor. They stay about the same, is his argument. John Levy-Martin and I are giving a course on culture, including cultural continuity and change. And we've had sessions on Bourdieu, we've had sessions on a series of others, and most recently talked about Anne Swidler, who's a leading cultural theorist at Berkeley. And she has She's introduced ideas about a cultural toolbox, which people may use various cultural tools, but it's unclear how and why they choose which tool and what they use them for. That's a different category. So what I want to do today is pull together several strands of these related themes and try to give them a little more coherence. Remember our 5 classes of theories, then our section on the power elites and leadership. And what we want to do is build on these today, but the title of the section, number 3 in the course, is called Transformations in the Urban Context, the End of Government Growth, Cuts in Intergovernmental Grants, Breakup of Class Politics, and the Classic Left and Right. Okay, and I'll mention some of the specific readings as we proceed, but let me first link, in a sense, to sort of sketch simply 2 kinds of scenarios. A scenario where we might have more continuity, where you do what your parents say and you don't change, they don't change, and nobody thinks about transformations. Versus places where things are changing a lot. Where might rules of the game, dynamics, budgets, ideologies, views of right and wrong change dramatically? All right, we've got a number of pretty visible examples around the world right now. One is the example of war, that you have an invasion or a military conquest by an outside group. Perhaps the most, China has had these for thousands of years. One of the most dramatic was the Manchurians, the Manchus came into China, and basically, one of the most visible examples historically was Genghis Khan. Thousands of horseback riders came to Beijing and then went onward and conquered much of Russia, Eastern Europe, into much of the Asian continent was transformed by military invasion. And what was described as a somewhat more cultivated, peaceful, culture-sensitive court in Beijing, or let's say in the capital of China, was transformed into a more hierarchical, more militaristic kind of style of leadership by the Chinese state in conjunction with these differences. And I won't go into subtleties, there are all kinds of variations in China, but the simple point I'm making is military conquest by an outside group with a new kind of package of ideology is clearly one simple model of change. The European counterpart, the biggest counterpart, was Napoleon. Napoleon invaded Germany, Italy, Russia. He went to Russia. He went all the way through the Middle East and into Egypt and conquered all of these areas. And what was powerful there, in adding something to Genghis Khan, was not just the power of the soldiers. That is, these were both relatively small armies compared to the number of people they were conquering. They conquered, huge areas of the world. What was critical with Napoleon was he carried on not just troops and numbers, which are stressed in the IR, so-called realist theories, but I would add and stress the culture of the revolution. All right, which revolution? 1789. The French Revolution was a very culturally powerful event. It led to the end of to the royal rule. The aristocracy lost its status. You had the rise of new groups, and an ideology of equality, fraternity, liberté, égalité, fraternité. I would say equality, fraternity, and freedom. Okay, so these elements and the shock which this revolution brought led lots of people to think differently about what they might live and what they might do. For France, it meant a more centralized, strong, militaristic state. Napoleon going out. For Germany, it meant the opposite. Germany did not have a strong state. It had small, weaker principalities, dukedoms, states, Prussia, Bavaria, Schleswig-Holstein, and so forth. And they did not have a national ideology or program or state institution. Where did nationalism emerge in Germany? In the culture of the idea of Germany. So Hegel was sometimes labeled an idealist, but he was reflecting, in that sense, reflecting is a strong word. He was in sync with Wagner, Nietzsche, the state builder, the ideologues of the German nation, that is Goethe, the intellectuals who created a sense of German identity and German gods, German folklore, and so forth, which in turn, only in around 1870 with the Franco-Prussian War, did Bismarck put this together and they built a strong, finally, late, a strong German state. But for 70 years or so, in the early 19th century, the Germans were building a sense of nationalism and a cultural identity of specificity where culture played a more visible, active role coming first, rather than after military conquest, as in the case of Napoleon. So what I'm pointing you to is not only culture can lead, it can also follow depending on the context. And I'm using the nations and we'll come back to other variations of this. But these are things you sort of know. These are classic historic examples that many people have written about. And we want to relate them to urban change and dynamics as well. Both around the world and with dramatic changes in U.S. cities. Let me give you, say, just one or two more. We don't want too many examples, but Sophie's from nearby LA. One debate which is going on is between the Chicago School of Urban Analysis and the so-called LA School. Okay, the LA folks have had a conference and they've published a book on Route 128. This cover of the book is Route 128 from Chicago to LA. It's the old highway. All right. The idea is that urban theory is migrated to LA, but basically the core ideas are a bit of Frankfurt Marxism combined with a sort of film studio subjectivism and romanticism, an anti-scientific lack of systematization, and a focus on the economy and sorts of games, not politics or the specifics of cultural dynamics explicitly. By contrast, Chicago folks use more politics and culture as more explicit central variables, specifically ethnicity. All right, ethnicity in Chicago is what the Europeans were and are fighting about, and the North Africans and others today. That is the nation of Germany, the nation of Egypt, the nation of Iraq and Iran. That is fighting these wars over such issues continued within U.S. neighborhoods. If you had Iraq, Iran, ISIS, Al-Qaeda followers within American cities today, within these returning ISIS fighters are a big issue for the security concerns. Germany, Italy, Spain, and the U.S., a little bit less perhaps, England, but there have been a lot of ISIS fighters now coming back, and they're turning their attention to, blowing up things within countries like the U.S., France, Germany, and so forth, if they're not fighting in the field in Iraq and Iran, or say Iran, Syria. All right. Link this to the LA school. The LA folks do not include ethnicity explicitly. So they'll talk about fragmentation around the city of LA, Orange County and so forth, but they don't name specific ethnic groups. They don't talk about Mexicans or Chinese or North Koreans, or mostly South Koreans in Orange County or Ventura County and so forth, where these dynamics are going on in ways that might be articulated differently. Why LA? Because in this example, LA is the metro area in the US that has the lowest trust, the most antagonistic conflict, road rage. In the last decade or two, there have been one or two events each year where you have a fighting police chief, police chase with helicopter coverage as the car is being chased, over 100 miles an hour by police cars, sirens going, lights on, all around. I mean, this is a big but repeated event in LA, sort of symbolizing this lack of trust, this wild, rampage and chase going on, in a sense, anti-establishment. That is, that guy does not, usually a guy, does not respect the police. Okay, so the police have then become another symbol in the last decades. Another lecture on that, so bring a bit of Black Lives Matter and so forth. And I'm not going to stress that so much today, so much as the changes and where and how these changes have emerged and evolved. So I'm pointing to some strong individual cases, some big historical past examples, and now we need some theory. Okay, bits of theory, then data to test the theory. Okay, bits of theory, I'm mentioning Bourdieu, continuity, social reproduction. Second, Ann Swidler, in her book on, she has a book on love where she articulates some of this further. But the core idea, that is one theme which she brings in, is times of continuity and stability versus times of turmoil. And when there is turmoil, then culture may change. But culture tends to be more continuous if you don't have turbulence. Okay, she has reinvented as well something which you may have seen in the second reading on the list. Before I get to the second, let's deal with the first. Aaron Wildavsky, first reading on the list. Wildavsky's theory was, in it, you could say, was similar to Bourdieu in the sense of stressing continuity. That is, he wrote multiple books on budgeting in the national government, in the state of California, in Oakland, California, where he did a series of books with students. And their big theory was called incrementalism. Last year's budget is the same as this year's budget with a little increment, as budgets would generally go up. Then came along something in California called Proposition 13, where the voters, where 66% of the voters said, cut property taxes by half. This went on in Oakland, for instance. They put up signs all over the place. If Proposition 13 passes, this swimming pool will close. This school will have trouble continuing the programs and so forth. This clinic will not be able to give injections, and so they stress specific cuts in services by neighborhood if Prop 13 has passed. And what happened? Prop 13 passed. Jerry Brown was then governor of California. He's governor again today. He had deeply all the business elites, Floyd Hunter's business elite, the civic elites, the political parties, Democrat, Republican, the media. Everybody had said, don't pass Prop 13. This will create a disaster. The citizens said, the hell with you. And they voted yes on Prop 13. Okay. Jerry Brown the next day acted as a new fiscal populist and said, I will implement this prop. The voters have spoken. I will implement their will with all the force that I have in my position in my office. And we will make these changes in government and management. Okay. So you have in some context like that, big cultural and policy change. Okay, so question is, how much did a leader like Jerry Brown have an impact above and beyond the other things? I mean, the fact that he and the business elites and the civic elites and the media all opposed it, and the citizens did the opposite, says the community power literature, which we talked about, said very little about voters, citizens. It talked about business elites, civic elites, unions, parties, and so forth. The one person who introduced it was Dahl, but Dahl still was an elitist theorist. I mean, he attacked Downs, who talked about citizens really driving things, to say, and so he stressed that a mayor, like the mayor of New Haven, could be responsive to citizens, but citizens don't do anything on their own. I mean, that was Downs' kind of view, and so even Dahl played down the citizens as direct sources of policy. Okay, where and why might these things be contextualized? And now we're introducing some of the themes which you saw of stressing context. You've seen this in our comparative studies of community power, where we move to the comparative, the fourth line. That is not Dahl, not Hunter, but the comparativists who stress not just centralization or decentralization, but why? What about the context changes the rules of the game? Okay, let's then briefly introduce, I'll give you the finding and then we'll come back to the interpretation. Okay, in the second reading, so Wildavsky, just to finish up Wildavsky, this is Wildavsky, very smart, very opinionated guy, very tough, not easily shaken in his views of anything, completely changed his view of social science and the world after Prop 13 passed. And after that he said, my theory of incrementalism failed. The policy is not just a little bit of change. This was a revolution. Okay, so how to interpret that? He basically looked then for a new paradigm. He searched all around. He looked for collaborators, and he found Mary Douglas, leading British anthropologist. And they did a book together called Risk and Culture. And he then used they developed a fourfold paradigm of types of governance and leadership. Slavery, markets, hierarchy, and a sort of competitive situation. That is, different types of relationship between citizens and leaders were at the core. He then used this in at least six or seven books, including the one on the reading list, which is a history of how budgeting patterns and policies changed throughout the whole Western world from the ancient Greeks up to present. And he then applied this to all the presidents of the United States and how they took different positions and which ones had some impact or not. He tried to keep elaborating this political cultural analysis of how policy is made. Okay, if that's a general, a little bit looser and broader, but nevertheless what I'm stressing from this is the breakdown of the incrementalist idea of social reproduction, and in a sense, there can also be big change, but you can have both in different time periods, in a sense, is one of the patterns emerging from that. The next reading is Clark and Ferguson, City Money, chapter 5 and 7, 5, 6, 7. And so we have chapters on black power, militant unions, and social movements, then the taxpayers' revolt, and how each of these had impact. Okay, if those are some of the actors that were critical, especially African American but ethnic groups mobilized, unions and social movements,
There should be 2 markers on the podium.
Red and green.
Yeah, that's all we had today.
All right. Green for the Irish today. the big pattern basically was from 1960 to 70, and 70 to 74, and then 74 onward. And the question is, who affected policy? So if we measured, we had here a bunch of cities, national sample of cities, and we have impacts of the mayor, organized groups, and citizens. Citizens measured simply by the proportion of people in a certain income category, the educational level, some of the ethnic makeup. So we had those measures. Then we had organized groups, especially unions, political parties, ethnic groups who may have been active. Then we had interviews with the mayors asking them, do you want to spend more, same, or less? So on their fiscal policies and certain social policies like abortion. Then we had measures of the power of the mayor, to weight the mayor's views by his specific, that is, mayors in the U.S. vary hugely in how much legal authority they have. So we weighted the mayor's views times authority, I should call it, legal authority. Okay, the powerful, simple finding was citizen characteristics drove policy in the first period. In the second period, it was these, and in the third period, it was these. These were basically 0. Okay, so if this is a brute finding, now let's try to interpret it. How does this fit with the theories and these examples I'm giving you, and how can we make sense of this? Okay, let me give you a little bit of description. What happened in these years, 70 to 74? 3 big things were visibly there. First and probably most important was the political mobilization of African Americans. From the end of slavery until the early 60s, they were still disenfranchised in the South. With national government support, the civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s successfully registered and enfranchised black voters, who in turn voted out the most racist Southern white politicians. But the battle was hard and long and mobilized people and money, and as it succeeded increasingly in the South, civil rights leaders asked, why not try the North too? There are lots of problems we can try to address in northern cities, and the general analytical point is to think about the culture of the South from Elazar. Hierarchical. The populist style of organizing against it was used successfully by the civil rights groups. Challenge. Authority. Its main force was the SCLC, led by Southern Christian Leadership Conference, led by Martin Luther King. How did this relate to cities and northern cities? Black mobilization has changed Chicago's political culture, but the situation is still enough in flux. The very processes of change are so unusually graphic that we motivated it and monitored it with an, I wouldn't say we motivated it in this, I put the two together because my collaborator was Bill Grimshaw, who was the campaign manager and speechwriter of Harold Washington. And Harold Washington was a key player here. And we started an oral history which continues to present at the time of the Harold Washington election. And our interviews were with activists, brought out the hatred of former Mayor Daley, one, and his Democratic machine. The tactical ploys to unveil its hierarchical, oppressive quality were consciously used again and again to mobilize black supporters. As an organizing tactic, Martin Luther King in the South would typically choose openly racist and potentially violent places to organize, like Birmingham, Alabama, where Police Chief Bull Connor had his men use cattle prods famously against demonstrators. But as many blacks moved to northern cities, the civil rights movement wanted to follow them. And to capture this cultural flavor, a little quote here. Listen to Dorothy Tillman, now former alderman, she's alderman for 15, 20 years, and Democratic Party committeeman from Harold Washington's old 3rd Ward in Chicago. She and another King co-worker, Jesse Jackson, helped mobilize black support against Mayors Daley and Byrne and eventually persuaded U.S. Congressman Harold Washington to run for mayor. How did they mobilize? Her answer: in the same way and with the same people as under Martin Luther King. Find a hierarchical opponent demonstrate against it, try to force the hierarchy to use violence to stop your demonstration, supporters will then rally to you. But this was called nonviolence. See, they were not terrorists. They did not use guns. They did not beat people up the way the unions and others. Earlier in the U.S., the major issue closest to this was unionization. 1890s, the Pullman strike, 1930s, lots of violence of strikers, goons, etc. Not with Martin Luther King. He said morality and honesty, that is appeal implicitly, you can almost hear it here, to the third party, the viewers on television, not the police. As Dorothy said, that's what they call me, the movement baby. I guess because I'm from Montgomery and grew up with the civil rights struggle and I've been involved all your life. How'd you get up here? The headquarters called me to go on the northern tour, to go with Dr. King on the northern tour. So they picked their best. I was always like an advanced person, you know, to go ahead. We toured the whole north to decide which city we were going to work in. I didn't like it, but the consensus about coming to Chicago was that if we can crack Chicago, we can crack the world. That it would all go across. So they tried, they mobilized, 1968, 67, King came here. 68, 69, Democratic Party Convention. Richard Daley said to us, quote, "You won't win here. The way you won in the South was they beat your heads. We're going to make sure they don't touch you here." And that's what he did. I mean, he was smart now. Okay? He was not a Bull Connor. He knew the tactics of Martin Luther King, and he responded accordingly. Okay. Chicago police haven't always gotten that straight in later years. Okay. So one point of this hierarchy principle is that as hierarchy declines, it's harder to mobilize against it. The Daley moved symbolically away from hierarchy, as have more and more of the Europeans in some Asian governments and organizations. Okay, so example 1, and civil rights. Example 2, the transformations in the U.S. and the West with the Vietnam War. A huge budget drain as well as a drain on the legitimacy of the political leadership. Fear of conscription by students and young persons heightened their resistance and efforts to mobilize. In China, this was Tiananmen Square. Later, but a similar and analogous event. Third, students on campuses mobilized against the Vietnam War and developed a style that combined traditional union organizing with the civil rights demonstrations of Southern blacks. Bullhorns, sit-ins, large crowds, militant and moralistic speakers, confrontation with some to invoke the hierarchy and force them to repress you. Washington and Vietnam were too far away, so campus authorities were attacked as repressive, but a critical piece of this was television coverage, media, which made these not local, but became national events. Fourth, unionization of the public sector employees was occurring at the same time. As the U.S. grew rapidly with the poverty program, it was easy for demands to be more militant than in most periods. This was also a time of plateauing and then decline for most unions that did well in large industries, General Motors and so forth, but did poorly in the new small service firms. So the organizers instead shifted away from industry and went to work in government and universities. We had a vote here on this campus. This continues. Who knows what union came to? Okay. So these 4 themes, black political mobilization, Vietnam, campus radicalism, and public sector unionization, all shared themes and borrowed tactics from one another. They all wanted publicity. They borrowed tactics in a book documented called Freedom Summer, where they saw you could sometimes have peaceful demonstration as in the civil rights tradition, but also you could be tough and militant, bullhorns, ideological claims that were not as religious as King, but were closer to the old Marxist tradition that New York intellectuals brought, combining it with elements of Marxism, the Frankfurt School, and so forth in the late 60s. But the point is, locally, these four things were all going on simultaneously. With big centers, they're centers of action. Big cities are centers of action. They all portrayed themselves as fighting for democracy against hierarchical opponents. And all of them succeeded, and yet they also failed. The drama of their success was often unrecognized, since their rhetoric and ambitious goals often presented as so-called unnegotiable demands, quote unquote, which were seldom fully met. We should have equal income for all. We should have, half the people hired should be women, etc. But compared to what was there before, they brought dramatic change in each of their respective areas. They all built in turn on deeper changes. The larger size of black populations in northern cities, the increasing education of the general population, the expansion of higher education and government programs, an economy of almost continuous growth since World War II. And we systematize these in the books which you've seen on the list, but I'm giving you a little bit of the descriptive there, what happened in this period, which can explain this. And then there are three propositions at the beginning of chapters, either chapter 1 or chapter 2 of City Money, where we have three more general factors from which we can derive these specifics. One is turbulence. If you have a turbulent political system, and such as guys coming into City Hall with chains, as the Black Panthers did. See, they come in and say, we got some unnegotiable demands, and so you have one person there as the speaker, and you have 10 guys holding these chains and sort of they jingle the chains a little bit. And they've got maybe some machine gun cartridges on their chests and things like that. In those days, they didn't have so many inspections and so forth. This was scary to most American mayors and council members. So the turbulence, that is, these were combined with, that is, I didn't explicitly and separately mention, but in addition to the civil rights movement, what was going on that mayors were also reacting to. Maybe I should make this a separate point. Riots. There were riots. And initially it was a handful of cities. Newark, Cleveland, but by the late 60s, by the time we got up to 1970, these had happened all over the U.S. in practically every city, every medium-sized or larger city with a significant African-American population. You'd had looting, burnings, that is, the themes which you see now with Black Lives Matter that is, Black Lives Matter today is echoing a lot of the style, the symbolism, the rhetoric, and the events, the sense of excitement in the streets, the scariness of the streets, the violence, the shootings, so forth, of these late 60 years. And for mayors, let me add one more theme here. As we look at this internationally, globally, Genghis Khan and Napoleon didn't come along very often. These were very unusual events. And for the U.S., that is, U.S. political history is, especially at the urban level. I mentioned the Bay Area. They couldn't get anybody to run for city council. It was sort of sleepy governance. And that was a more general style, let's say, in the 50s, the 60s, and for a number of years. And there was simply continual, gradual growth of government. Things got better, quote, in the sense of bigger service, more swimming pools, more freeways, nicer University of California campuses, and so forth. But then you have, bang, Prop 13. You've got these riots. That is, mayors, and I've cited Jerry Brown as an example, didn't know what they should do. Okay, so example one is turbulence. If there's turbulence in a political system, then you're not clear what rules of the game you should follow, and should you follow the same program that you ran on. Or fast forward to Donald Trump. So Trump is breaking the rules of the traditional Republican Party. He's fighting with them. He'll sign something with the Democrats, maybe. But the point is, this is not just the U.S., this is not just Trump. France, this is happening. Germany, the leading parties have gone down. Italy, they went down 15, 20 years ago. You now got 20 different parties instead of the 3 or 4 that dominated Italian politics. This is happening in many other places. So, I will join one more theme here, and we'll go back and forth between events and symbolism, sort of theorizing these. 1789 was labeled in the three words of the ideology, but this was a revolution! Revolution! Okay, that was scary. This was exciting and scary to the political leaders at the time. And the political leaders didn't know what you do. You do the wrong thing, you get guillotined. Okay. In France. So then 1848, there were similar revolutions across much of Europe. 1848 sparked a particularly important statement. It wasn't the three words of 1789. What was it? Karl Marx. Okay, so Marx's Communist Manifesto really was linked with the 1848 revolutions. And so the sense that there are iron laws of history, that we have feudalism, then capitalism, then socialism, then communism, and that this has to be pushed ahead by revolution, and there will be blood. You know, the sense of the excitement of change as you move from one historical era to another carried on some of this in writings in ways that people are trying to find analogs or keep it alive in an appropriate way today. So, the revolution theme. This has then been battled over, I mentioned, in interpretations of the rise and the decline of civic groups in the U.S. I mentioned Putnam's argument, or not just his findings basically, that civic groups are declining, and yet they're still important. I mean, they're major, as Tocqueville discussed earlier, but they became, and so where and how did these things shift in their dynamics? So I'm introducing Putnam in order to introduce a second counter-attacking Putnam, which is Theda Skocpol. Her view is the driver, the contextual driver which she introduced, number of papers and books, is war. That war is what mobilized people to create the civic groups and to lobby for the rise of the American welfare state. Weak as it was, its beginnings were in, she points to, Civil War veterans. After 1865, they created a series of organizations and started to lobby for more rights for the military, for former military, for veterans, and so forth. This was the beginning of the American welfare state and of the civil sector. Then she cites World War I, where there was patriotism, and especially World War II, where you have massive political mobilization and the rise of the stronger American state, continuing with the 1960s, the anti-poverty programs. I mean, so those are each wars. When she came to Chicago, I asked her, Theda, she had a public speech, an open discussion. So with a public question, I said, how about Vietnam? And she couldn't answer it. Okay, so I'm saying these are hard questions, but there's not one simple answer, but but what she did add usefully to that conversation about Tocqueville was the context. And so war may be too simple, but I would say turbulence, the political turbulence, is a critical thing to take out from her interpretation of war. So I've got it here. Actually, I wrote this before Theda had that stuff. So I mentioned political turbulence is one. Related to, and so I gave the example of the Black Panthers, the mayor who wasn't sure what to do. That in turn, why is the mayor not sure what to do? It's factor two. Information about citizen preferences, or what people want and what they will give up, and so forth, especially from the citizens, but maybe from civic groups as well. That is, if you don't know what citizen preferences are, if you have a new group like, say, the Black Panthers, who would come and say, don't listen to Martin Luther King, he's a pacifist. Listen to us, you know, we're the tough guys, we're going to fight in the streets, and we burned those houses down, you know, we led the troops in the streets. You better give us some things that we want, or you're going to burn right here in City Hall. Okay. And so a lot of mayors said, well, what would you like? You know, and so they negotiated. And what you saw as well was a big increase in spending from 1970 to 74. That is, the mayors and these certain civic groups were more important in affecting changes in budgets. Budgets went up from 70 to 74. Why not in 68 or earlier? As I would say, this is a national pattern of the whole U.S. This was the average for all U.S. cities at that time. I'll add a qualification in a minute or two. But I want to bring in factor 3. So factor 1 is turbulence. Factor 2 is information. Factor 3 is the fragmentation or the similarity of the political constituency generally, or more specifically, the multiple ways that you can create what political scientists call a minimal winning coalition. That is, how can you build 50% in one vote that will back you as mayor or prime minister or whatever. And the idea is that if you live in a place like the Netherlands or let's say Denmark, where people tended to be in the past relatively homogeneous, religiously, socially, culturally, it's easier than if you have something like northern and southern Italy, or the American South versus New England, or that is in the US, Australia are countries of immigrants where you have strongly diverse and different groups, and they don't organize along the kind of class lines that they do in Scandinavia. That is, the social homogeneity of Scandinavia makes class politics more powerful. So it's more dominant in Scandinavia. Economic issues, union management is the classic old Scandinavian conflict. But they don't have the nationalist issues based on heterogeneity of, and so this is why we need, that is, it's why in the U.S. in particular, or more generally in Australia, a country of immigrants where you have more social diversity, this is, or put more generally, to test this proposition, we can look at cities, because cities vary in whether they're very homogeneous, the classic lily-white suburb where everybody's middle class and they worry about their lawn and good schools, versus places where you've got, south side of Chicago, or north, you've got all kinds of, hundreds of different immigrant groups and different backgrounds, and they don't know who they are, they don't, etc. Okay, so the degree of diversity is something we can test, and we have tested with these kinds of patterns, and these are the findings which we're coming up with. Okay. Rufus Browning, Dale Rogers Marshall, and David Taft. Protest is not enough. They have their first volume, their first edition was on 10 cities in the Bay Area, and how they became highly politicized, and conflict in these years around 68, 69, and then that began, but then mostly with Proposition 13, which was 74, I think. They really mobilized against the traditional city manager style. And in about 6 of the 10 cities, they voted out the majority. They brought in a new style of governance where women, Mexicans, African Americans were more explicitly included in governance. They voted out, as I said, a number of the city council members. They replaced them with new council members. They fired the city managers. And the council became more active politically rather than the older style of California government, which from the 1890s onward was called the reform. That is, in the state constitution in California, there may be no political parties on a local government election ballot. Non-partisanship was required of all cities in California in ways that